year or so is we started with the Hebrew alphabet. We did one letter a week. Put some weeks off in there. And then we took a little break with the Hebrew stuff, and then we started and we decided we would learn the first 7 words of the Torah in Hebrew. And we are on our 7th word tonight. So I wanted to review. We've got, and there'll be a quiz.
Did that quiz be on the 3rd week of the month?
All right. So first word, Bereshit. We talked about the letters and some other things about the word. I put the sounds that each of those Hebrew letters makes above it. And then we talked about the vowel points, the things that this makes this say so it was ba. And then you had and a was the dots next to each other, so ray, so ba, ray, sheet. Okay, and that's how it's built. Just for those of you who haven't been here or whatever. And that Reshit was the word that meant beginning. And in Hebrew, with words like and the and in and on and with and all these little words, they just stick a letter onto the front of the word and it is combined. So when they stuck the bet here on the front of it, it becomes in beginning. There's no the here. It's just in beginning. But it sounds better in our language to say in the beginning, right? Okay, so that was in beginning, Bereshit. And then the second one was our verb, bara, create. In beginning, create. Or created, actually. We talked about the perfect and the imperfect tense. And in Hebrew, there's just 2 things. There's either something that's done or something that's not done. And that this is in the form that says it's done. Okay, so in beginning, created. And then we talked about Elohim. And I'm just putting Elohim. I'm not putting God here like the translations, because when we talked about this word, we talked about how much is wrapped up in this word that kind of got stripped away when we just said God. Yeah. Instead of looking at how many pieces, when we broke this apart and looked at the letters, how much more there was to that than typically what a person would think when they think God. So then we did the 4th word, which was one of my favorites, the Aleph Tav, okay? And it is not translated as anything. If you look in your interlinear, there's no word underneath it. Okay. And then the 5th word, no. The 5th word was Ha-Shamayim, and this is just like that bet, when we put an in beginning, this here says the. Whenever you have a word and you put a hey on the front, you're saying the, whatever the word is. And so we had Shamayim, which means sky or heavens, and then we put a hey on the front, so we have the heavens. Did you have a question about that?
Yeah, why would heaven start with the shoes, the fire symbol? Isn't that strange?
Well, when we did this word, we talked about, we started with that, and we talked about mayim, and mayim means water, right? Yeah. And on the 2nd day of creation, what did he do? He separated the waters, the above waters and the below waters. And when we put a shin on the front, actually what happens is we have 2 words here. We have sham, which means there, and we have mayim, which means water. So we have the here water, and we have the there water. Okay, and that's how we were going to remember shamayim. It's the there water, the water that's up there. Okay, so then we moved to the 6th word, which was very much like the 4th word, remember? That was the 4th word. That is the 6th word. And we talked about the implications of that and the timeline and what the Aleph Tav meant. And this Aleph Tav is pierced with the nail, the letter that means nail. And then when you put this on a word, this is how you say and whatever. I said there'd be a quiz, and that's the only thing. Okay? When we put a vav on the front of a word, it means and. With me?
Yep.
Okay, we've done all that. Now we're on our last word. I'm not going to start with the whole word again. I'm going to start with a piece of it. Okay, we have arets. Okay, these triple dots say eh. And you'll see that this will actually change because when you start tacking things on, sometimes these vowel points change and it's pronounced a little differently. But don't worry about that. We have arets, which means land or earth. Sometimes it's translated as nation. Okay. And we have a new letter we haven't seen before in any of these first 7 words, and that's the tzadeh, which is the righteous man. If you picture a guy kneeling with his hands up in prayer, like this is his head, these are his hands, he's kneeling. Okay, that's a way to remember the tzadeh, and that is a letter in tzedakah, which is righteous acts. Okay. And so I'm just going to stick one more letter on, and that will be our 7th. Okay, I'm going to put a hey on the front. Okay, so it's not just earth, it's the earth. Okay, because remember, hey on the front means the. So we have the earth. Now, here's your quiz. What does that mean?
And.
We put a vav on the front. And so now we have and the earth, which is the 8th word. Va-ha-aretz. Remember? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and void. Okay, so that's your 8th. So you got a bonus word here.
Woo-hoo.
Not the 8th one. Okay, it's just the 7th one with that on the front. So now you can read the first 8 words of the Torah in Hebrew, ideally. Take some practice. Okay, and then there was a little thing I wanted to say about this. You may have heard about this. I've only heard this a couple times. There's some Hebrew legend or myth, or I don't know what you want to know, extra biblical story, that when God gave the Torah to Moses, he wrote it in a circle. Okay, there was no beginning or end. And so Moses had to take a sword and cut it somewhere. And that he cut it. And if you finish the Torah, every year we finish the Torah and we go right back into it, right? Okay, no beginning, no end. Kind of follows that pattern of Hebrew thinking. We're not A to B, we are in a circle. Okay? So Moses cut it right between the last word that we see and Bereshit. Okay, and so now, if you look at what does the Torah start with? What letter? Anybody?
Bet.
Bet. Okay. Does anyone know what letter it ends with?
Olive.
No.
Tar.
No.
I have no idea.
Huh?
Is it Ben?
No. It's Lamed. Lamed. Okay. So if you take the last letter of the Torah and you put it next to the first letter of the Torah, do you know what word it spells?
Lev.
Lev.
Heart.
Heart. So it's almost like he opened his heart and showed it to us in the Torah. Cool. That's all I got.
Oh, that's good.
That's all you get.
That's all you get.
We're picking up in Acts chapter 15, and if you have your Bible, please do open that. I'm just going to read a section. I've already read the entirety of Acts chapter 15 to you twice for story time, and I know you enjoyed it. But tonight I'm just going to read a couple of segments, starting in verse 13, going through 17, 18, and 19, and up to 21, I think. Because we have reached the portion where the council, led by Jacob, James, Jesus' brother, is about to issue the verdict of this synod of the First Jerusalem Council, and this is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. So I want to reread that portion in Acts chapter 15, verse 13, starting. Ready? Jacob broke the silence to reply. "Brothers," he said, "hear what I have to say. Simon Peter has told in detail what God did when he first began to show his concern for taking from among the Gentiles a people to bear his name. And the words of the prophets are in complete harmony with this, for it is written, "After this I will return, and I will rebuild the fallen tabernacle of David. I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it, so that the remnant of mankind may seek the Lord, that is, all the Gentiles who have been called by my name, all the nations, says the Lord who is doing these things. All this has been known for ages. Therefore, my opinion is that we should not put obstacles in the way of the nations who are turning to God. Instead, we should write them a letter telling them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from fornication, from what is strangled, and from blood. For from the earliest times Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, with his words being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day." So that is the decision reached by the Jerusalem Council in regards to the two burning questions that were brought before the council from last week. Do you remember what those two burning questions were? What were the two issues that we were dealing with? Where's the trouble coming from, and what is the trouble? Please, yes, Paul?
Talking about the circumcision
Circumcision is the big issue.
and direction to observe the law of Moses.
They must observe the Torah of Moses in order to be saved. Okay, so we discussed those three terms in some detail last week. Circumcision, saved, and the Torah of Moses. And we discovered that it does not mean what we think it means. That the first century Jew would understand those three terms potentially vastly different than we do. We think of these things a little bit more differently. What did we notice about circumcision? We think of a medical procedure, but they think of it much more differently. Circumcision is a code for what? Conversion to Judaism. Full-on conversion to Judaism. So, we have determined, we're about to determine here, do Gentiles need to convert to Judaism in order to be saved? Probably not. Okay. Second issue, what is saved? When we think about it from a very individualistic perspective, if you remember from last time, that we're often talking about, well, you're either going to heaven or you're going to hell, or you're going to be in the kingdom or not. But remember that the word saved can encompass a lot more options than we're normally used to considering. That it literally could be, remember that they were living in a time that they believed was strongly messianic. It's likely that they believed Yeshua was about to return imminently, and they were possibly also contemplating other areas of salvation and not just your eternal destiny of your soul. Jimmy?
Peter wrote about the baptism that saves you.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
extremely problematic for us in the West.
Right.
Saves from what?
Exactly. It says it's able to save your soul, and we've talked about that before from Paul's perspective of how a human is composed of a body and a soul and a spirit. And what is the soul? It is you. It's your mind, will, and emotions. You got a body, which is this stuff, this dirt. You got a mind, will, and emotions, which is your soul, and the spirit, the breath of God that gives animation to you and makes you what you are. So when Peter says that baptism now saves you, and the pure milk of the word, which is able to save your soul, Jacob says, save your soul is save your mind, will, and emotions. That's a different thing. Salvation encompasses, if you remember from our study in Matthew a couple of years ago, salvation is past, present, and future. You have been saved, you are being saved, and you will be saved. All three parts of you. So remember that. Now, moving forward with this, I want to take a look at we had discussed briefly those two concepts of circumcision and salvation. Now, we didn't get an opportunity to really go into the Torah of Moses, because that's where the second part of it comes in, and that seems to be a pretty big part of it. The Gentiles must observe the Torah of Moses, the Pharisees say, the sect of the Pharisees who had believed. Now, I want to talk about this yoke idea, because Peter says, why do you seek to place a burden on the neck of these people that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear? Now, that caused us some small amount of heartburn when we think about that. That's a tough statement. And there are, it seems to be saying the Torah is a heavy yoke that is impossible to bear. And our ancestors have never been able to do it, and we've never been able to do it. And thank God Jesus has set us free from having to do the Torah. The only problem with that is, there are several problems with that. It is contradicted by Jesus himself. It is contradicted by Paul. It is contradicted by James. It is contradicted by Peter. So either we are contradicting ourselves, or we have a bit of a misunderstanding here that we need to iron out those wrinkles and see what we're looking at. So it starts with the idea of a yoke. I mean, when we think of a yoke, oftentimes we're thinking about the parable that Yeshua talked about when he said, "Take my yoke upon you, for my burden is light." And he had also spoken about the yoke of the Pharisees. What did he say about the yoke of the Pharisees? That they tie heavy burdens upon people, but they're not willing to do it with one finger themselves. Now, is that a condemnation of the Torah, or is that a condemnation of the yoke of the Pharisees? And is there a difference? What's that?
Criticism of the Talmud, most likely.
The Talmud,
The extra burdens.
the extra commandments. Okay, yeah, absolutely. Jimmy?
I was listening to Daniel Lappin the other day.
Sure.
He's the youneedarabbi.com guy.
Yeah, I
I
remember.
really like him.
Sure.
But he's talking about, because 3 times in Torah we're told not to cook a calf in its mother's milk.
Mm-hmm.
That's why because we're told 3 times, that's why they completely separate Gary, even though he's willing to admit that Abraham served
Meat and
dairy
cheese.
products along with meat when he met with the Trinity, what it seemed appears
Sure,
to be
sure.
the triune God.
Yeah, understood. So I think that we have we need to take a brief gander at this concept of a yoke. And I have, you've seen a yoke. If you just think about it for a moment, the yoke, what is its purpose?
It's not just a burden, it's connecting two things.
That's right. The yoke itself is not the burden, is it? What is the burden? Well, the burden is whatever's behind the cows. The cows are yoked together to do what? So that they can walk in unison, and there's strength in numbers and braid of cords. You know what you've heard all these metaphors and ideas regarding sharing a burden. And you know that there's a Torah commandment that says you shall not yoke an ox with a donkey, right? That's in Deuteronomy 21. So what is the purpose of that commandment? Why would God command you to not yoke an ox with a donkey together? Any ideas?
They don't pull the same.
Yeah, they don't pull the same. One's going to be dragging the other, and the one's going to be carrying the whole weight. The donkey's going to get drug along by the ox. That's unequally yoked. Isn't that an interesting concept? So the interesting thing here is that the yoke does a couple of things, okay? The common misperception is that the yoke is an evil and a burdensome thing. But what's interesting is that a yoke connects and directs. A yoke it connects two things together to enable them to be directed. This yoke is attached through the rope here. It enables these two animals to work in unison to get the work done, and it also enables the farmer in the back to control them. So if you are yoked to the Torah, it means that you are connected to and directed and connected by God and His Word. we have to change our perception of what a yoke is and does. And I think that once we examine this a little more carefully, you'll have a different idea about what Peter might be saying when he says, why do you seek to test God by placing a yoke on the disciples that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? Because he seems to be denigrating the Torah, the commandments of God. And yet God himself says on more than one occasion, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Now that's the words of Yeshua. But did Moses say that about the Torah itself? Yes, he did. On 3 separate occasions. He said, this word that I command you today is not too hard for you. It's not up in heaven that you have to go and find somebody to get it for you. It's not across the sea. It's near you. It's in your heart. It's in your mind. You can do it. We have common misunderstandings regarding what God has instructed us to do. And you know, if you have been exposed to the Torah as a valid thing, and not just a collection of stories that you jump through at random for kids' stories on a flannel graph, you know that as you have begun to read the book of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, that there are instructions in there. It's all instructions regarding what is good and what is bad, what is holy and what is profane, what is good and what is evil. It is the very definition of what is right and what is wrong. There are some things in there which are strange and mysterious, like you shall not mix linen and wool. That's a little unusual. The rabbi, what is that?
Wasn't that in the priestly garments?
Yes.
So that would make sense that we're not into it.
Well, not threaded together.
Not threaded together, yes, but I mean, if you had a linen shirt and a woolen tassel on the end of it, it's not exactly threaded together, but they are connected. So there is that idea. Some have suggested that because this is part of the high priest's garment, that not just anybody can wear this, and that's the nature of that prohibition. Others have suggested that there's some kind of weird fundamental frequency of the universe which will clash if you connect linen and wool together. Getting into the mysterious stuff there. If you're one of these Hebrew roots conspiracy people, you're going to love that.
If you wash it, it'll shrink differently.
And that's a practical consideration.
Well, and also that's why you shouldn't mix your seeds in an area, because if you plant corn all together, they grow much better if it's all one strain.
And those of you who have seen my garden outside, I accidentally created some cuckolopes one year. I planted my cucumbers and my cantaloupes a little too close together and ended up cutting open some cantaloupes that smelled like cucumbers. And I thought, that's not going to be good. That's mixing. It made it worthless. It was gross. I didn't eat it because I don't, you bust it open, you're expecting to smell a certain thing, and that was not it. So, sorry. I got sidetracked. I apologize. Sorry. So, yoked to Yeshua and the Torah is connected to and directed by the Word of God. Now, we mentioned, and we're getting into this a little bit deeper as we talk about the Torah and what they're referring to when they say, they must obey the commandments from Moses. We talked about that before, but I think it might help us to possibly rephrase this statement. Because of their perception of what the Torah is, and I have mentioned this to you on many, many occasions, the Torah to a first century Jew and today encompasses 3 things. What are those 3 things? The first 5 books of the Bible. What else? The oral Torah, which is included in the Talmud, and the traditions of the elders that are not written down and just go back to generations. We don't even know where they came from. So when a Jew says the Torah of Moses, he is not talking about the straight up, pure word of God that was delivered face to face from God to Moses, and he wrote down in the first 5 books of your Bible. When a Jew says Torah, he is not talking about that. He is talking about that plus this plus this. He's talking about a whole mix of things. And that's why That's a heavy burden. If you go to Israel today, for example, and I know many of you have been there, the whole place is closed down on Shabbat, right? But how many people actually observe Shabbat in Israel? Not very many. It's a pretty low number. It's somewhere up on the order of 10 to 15% of the population of Israel, and that's approximately 7 million people, will actually, 10% of those will actually observe the Sabbath. And if you just ask your common Israelite on the side of the road, do you observe the Sabbath? They'll say, oh, that's way too complicated. That's too hardcore. I mean, light switches and toilet paper, and can't turn on this and that, and it can't drive, can't walk very far, can't leave the. It's
the Torah. It's all
when you read the
things that were added on.
Yeah, there's a whole
the
bunch
rules,
of stuff.
Don't use your car, don't use your phone,
Right.
that stuff.
Absolutely. So that's a whole slew, and there are literally 13,000 commandments regarding the Sabbath alone that have been added on to what Moses actually wrote. And we have discussed before that these are the intentions are good. We're building a fence around the Torah. I've mentioned this a couple of times, but when the stove is hot, we tell our kids don't touch the stove. But we feel like that may not be quite enough. Stay out of the kitchen. Don't even go into the kitchen. We've built a fence around the Torah to protect our children from the stove. It's a good idea, but it can get a little excessive, and it can also, you can forget where the fence is and where the commandment is. So we have to remember that. But when a Jew says they must obey the Torah of Moses, they are not thinking what you're thinking. They're thinking something altogether different. So I have two possible rephrases of this statement of Peter for your consideration, for you to think about, because I think that there's, in my mind, knowing what I know now after having studied this out for 8 years now, trying to figure this out, here's my supposition, and you can let me know what your thoughts are. You might say, why yoke the nations to our customs and traditions? That's one way of stating it. Why yoke the nations to our way of doing things? It's one possible interpretation. Another might be, why place too many restrictions on them all at once? Let's start small and work up from there. And I think that it's probably a combination of both. Do you know, those of you who have read your Bible a lot and you have done a lot of research and you know that thing like the back of your hand, who can tell me how many times the writers in the New Testament have made a distinction between the Torah of Moses and the Torah as interpreted and informed by all of these additional things? Who in the Bible of the New Testament said something to distinguish those things? Yeshua did. In what context and to what extent? Do you know?
I know the verse. He teaches doctrines of God, the commandments of men.
Okay, absolutely, absolutely. So he condemned the religious leaders of his day for teaching as doctrines of God the commandments of men. Absolutely. So we got one condemnation there. Anywhere else that you can think of? I know I don't remember who it was who came up to Yeshua's disciples and said, "Hey, how come your disciples don't wash their hands? Like the traditions, of the elders and such." So that was one thing. I mean, is there something in the Bible about washing your hands? No, there's not. Is it a good idea to wash your hands? It certainly is.
It's a health code.
Yeah, I mean,
quarantining certain leprous, stuff.
yeah. As far as ritual cleansing, yeah, but as far as just washing your hands and the way that they do it, that's not commanded in the Torah anywhere. It's certainly a good idea to wash your hands, but it's not a commandment of God. So we do have some examples in the New Testament of instructions being given to distinguish between the Torah.
Picking up your mat.
What's that?
Picking up your mat.
Picking up your mat. A Sabbath day's journey. Okay, is there anything in the Torah about a Sabbath day's journey? There's not. spitting in the mud and making clay to put on the guy's eyes, healing on the Sabbath,
Pulling grain in the field.
plucking heads of grain in the field, absolutely. So there's it now, and it all comes down to, in a lot of cases, your ideas about what is work, because that's you can just see that that's going to be open to interpretation, obviously. Let me ask you a question, and then we'll just pick somebody at random. Michael, what is your interpretation of work? When God says 6 days you shall labor and on the seventh day you shall not, what does he mean when he says stop working? Do no work on the Sabbath day. What do you think that means?
For me, it's don't work, don't do.
But what is? I want
everyday-
you to define work for me.
My everyday work, my everyday, what I do for a living.
What you do to make money?
Yeah.
Okay.
But also, I think that it's broader than that because it's you're not to cause others to work either, because it was everybody living amongst you as well.
Okay.
And that's something that I think I told you, came to understanding about. Well, shoot, I shouldn't be shopping either because now I felt guilty about it. I think you have to have a clear conscience. But then I was like, well, if I'm not working, I really shouldn't be causing others to work. But for me, it's an exchange for currency, or an exchange, something for payment, or something for.
Okay.
But cooking or going for a hike, those, to me, that's not work.
Sure.
Driving still.
Does that sound reasonable to everyone? Angela, that does sound reasonable to you?
Well, my work.
Your work.
And I love that you said you started your whole answer with for me. Yeah. Because for me, cooking and cleaning are work for me. That's my job. And so it's not that I let my family starve on those days, because that would be leaving the donkey in a ditch. Right? It's that I pick the easiest thing to cook.
Or you cook something on the day of preparation that is ready to eat and doesn't need to have much preparation, and that to me is that's good wisdom. That's good wisdom. So, but you can see that if you take this, you could go a little crazy and decide what all different kinds of work is. And boy, it's a little. Oh, sorry, Jan. It's work to walk that distance or something like that. Well, theoretically, but that's a little pushing it. Jan, go ahead.
Well, we love to cook,
Sure.
but we have decided that we are going to cook in advance
Mm.
and do the easiest thing possible.
Sure.
For Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have puppies, and we raise puppies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So only 1 or 2 litters a year. So this is not like something that happens all the time. But people want to get their puppies usually on the weekend.
Sure.
So what we say is you have to pay in advance. We do not do any money exchange on Sabbath.
Sure. You want to come and pick up your puppy on the Sabbath? That's great.
fine.
Blessings of the Sabbath to you. Take your puppy.
But we do not do any money exchange on Sabbath.
Sure.
So we have designed some parameters.
That makes sense for your family, from your perspective of what is work for you.
Anything that to do with relationship and nurturing the pets, because we have a lot of pets.
Sure.
The connection or anything like that. We will do that on Sabbath.
Sure.
We'll limit the cooking, no money exchange.
Right.
And this has been a big transition for us.
Sure.
But we've prayed about it a lot, and we're feeling really comfortable now with the way, and I'm sure it will be a process.
Sure,
There'll
sure.
be more and more things, but this is where we're at now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great observation. Angela?
Yeah, I think sometimes, and I remember, and it still happens, I'll be in the middle of something on the Sabbath, and I'll go, this starting to feel like work. And you just listen to that.
Yeah.
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 You gotta listen to that.
Absolutely.
And I think that at the heart of this is maybe this, that maybe you're supposed to rest from physical things, and that's supposed to be your day of getting your other food, your spiritual food. That's good. And
Yeah. Jimmy?
H.A. Heschel's my favorite Jewish philosopher.
Sure.
I gave you that book that's so hard to read.
I remember. That's
You're
hardcore.
right, this book, it's hard to read it, but
Yeah.
how could he height, depth, and not outer space, but
Yeah.
but
Three-dimensional space.
three-dimensional space
Sure.
and time. And that God wants one day for you to focus on time. You've got 6 days to fix the house and to make things better and create order
Right.
in the physical realm.
Right.
But that seventh day, he wants us to stop all of that and focus on eternal issues.
Right.
And to try to enter into his timelessness.
Yeah.
And the fact that everything's easy for God.
Yeah.
And so for us to take it easy and just enjoy cool stuff.
Yeah.
If you, like he said, like if you've got 2 bottles of wine, one's good and one's okay. He said on the Sabbath, have the one that's good. You know, big things.
I like that. That's great.
Yeah, have the other one on.
Now let me ask you this: you have suggested that the Sabbath is good and it's a time of rest, and I find that is absolutely true. I will tell you the truth though. When I first got started observing the Sabbath, it was slightly uncomfortable for me. I found it to be a little bit unnerving. Because I am if you haven't been able to tell, I'm a person who's going 100 miles an hour all the time. I'm very driven, A-type personality. You get stuff done, make sure others are getting stuff done, and I'm driving this bus. It was very uncomfortable for me to stop working and feel like I was just twiddling my thumbs and going, what am I doing with this time? It took me a couple of years, frankly, to become comfortable with the very concept of doing nothing. And it's not to say that I'm going to sit and just contemplate my navel or just, the only thing I can do on Sabbath is read my Bible and pray. And I certainly do that, but that's not all that I do. It's not needed. It doesn't need to be purely spiritual. It can be time to spend with friends and family and your children, your wife. But it took me a little while to get comfortable with that. It was a transition period for us, for sure. It was a little weird.
It's a sacrifice.
It is a sacrifice. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Jimmy?
Your coworkers won't like it.
No, they don't.
Never will they go, oh, groovy.
Yeah, you're right. Well, and at the time when I got started, I was in sales in real estate. And people said, you can't take Saturday off as a real estate agent. You're going to die. That's ridiculous. You can't do that. That is not true. That is not true at all.
That's why you have to, because you're going to die.
Think about the land Sabbath.
Sorry.
Think about the land Sabbath. How
The land,
silly
yeah.
must that have looked to the other nations?
Oh, yeah.
Plant anything for
Well, that's a good observation. However, I don't know that we have any biblical evidence that anyone ever did that.
That's true.
We don't.
It's commanded though.
It is absolutely commanded that the Shemitah and the Yovel year, if every 50th year and every 7th year, we have no evidence from the Bible that either of those commandments was ever observed.
What was that? I missed it.
The Jubilee and the Shemitah, every 7th year and every 49th, 50th year.
They never kept stuff together that long.
Well, we know that they were exiled to Babylon for 70 years because of not having allowed the Sabbath rest of the land every 7 years. That was precisely why they went into captivity for 70 years. But we don't have any biblical evidence that they ever kept that commandment. And you can imagine why that might be. To your human mind, to shut things down for a year, you're talking about a national economic collapse. How does that work? And I think that that, to me, would probably have to be one of the greatest of the commandments. The smallest being, if you see a mother bird was sitting on her eggs, you take the eggs, but you cannot take the mother. That's considered the smallest commandment of the Torah. I would consider the Shemitah and the Yovel, the 7th and the 50th year, to be probably the biggest, because that takes the most strong faith to understand how is this going to work if I stop and I don't plow my field for a year and I just allow it to grow by itself, whatever happens to grow there, and I can't go in and harvest it and sell it. I just got to let everyone in the community just have at it. The animals, the people, the poor, everyone's just going to eat from the land, and the land is going to have its rest. That doesn't make any sense to us, and we can't see how that would possibly work. Jimmy, and then...
Impeachment. Any Anybody that pushed that would get impeached.
Yeah, it's, undoubtedly. Hold on. Yes,
Was forgiving the debt too? Forgetting the debt part of that?
that never happened. They pledged to do it when Nehemiah and Ezra came back from Babylon, but then they reneged.
So was it commanded or not, though?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought it was.
Yes.
But and I want to get back to this, John, sitting on the couch or said about hiking.
Michael, yes.
Or taking a walk on the Sabbath.
Sure.
You know, if I've had friends call me to go hiking
Mm-hmm.
on the Sabbath and I won't go.
Okay.
Then I've heard other people say, well, you're not doing anything that's biblically incorrect
Sure.
by taking on. To me it is, because you're doing physical fitness. Which
Okay.
you want to do for yourself. So it's going your own way.
Okay.
Well, it says every man should
And that's
find a
cool.
place.
And you know what?
It doesn't say
You
anything specifically about tons of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to have to be open to interpretation. And I would say that there's nothing that I can advise you, and I would advise you not to allow me to advise you. I don't ask me, because what you're doing on the Sabbath is your business. That's between you and God. Can I give you some general guidelines? Yes. Whatever you're doing for money, don't do it on the Sabbath. Beyond that, that's going to be between you and God. And I don't think anyone in here should be telling anybody else what you should and should not be doing on the Sabbath. That's not your business. Whatever.
The byproduct is you have a lot of time to get in the Word and to study it and gain knowledge.
Yeah, that's a
Which
tremendously
I
valuable.
would not done otherwise, because I'm kind of like you with the.
Yeah, that's a great insight. Hold on a sec, Jen. Nathan Briscoe.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, it does say every man should stay in his own place. I think that is in the Torah.
That is in Exodus and that is
actually mentioned.
that is mentioned. However, it's mentioned in a very specific
It
context.
might be long distance travel. But
Well, I think that this is specific to this one instance where God had just come down and given these instructions, and a man willfully went out to collect sticks on the Sabbath day, and they stoned him to death. And then the immediate response from God is, everyone go home and stay there. And I'm not saying he's being hyperbolic, although he might have been. I don't think the instruction was for you to stay in your home on the Sabbath day. I think what he was saying was, everyone go to your tents and I'll want to give you more instructions. Okay, but that guy got stoned on the Sabbath day for willfully disobeying when God said, you shall not work. And he'd just given them those instructions twice. And that's a little bit more complicated, but that's my take on that passage, and you might have a different one, and that's totally cool.
It sounds too like he wasn't just like collecting whatever sticks. Like
Yeah.
He was actually doing
Well,
whatever.
yeah.
Well, and I want you to consider too, and I want you to consider too that it's not likely that he was going and just picking up a couple of sticks next to his house because he wanted to go home and start a fire to cook his meal or something like that. Okay, it's a lot of the scholars who have researched this out believe that what he was doing was collecting lumber to do work. And I don't know about you guys, have you ever tried lighting a fire without matches? Or a lighter? You guys watch Survivor on TV or something like that? That is some serious work. I ain't joking. I don't care if you got flint and steel, if you're using phosphorus, you got a little fire striker. That is hard work. Now, you got none of those accoutrements of modern society and you're rubbing some sticks together. You're talking about probably a minimum of an hour's worth of work just to get that fire started. That's a lot of work. And so from their perspective, in their culture, in that time, it makes a lot of sense. Get your fire stoked up on Thursday or Friday during the afternoon and keep some coals burning, because you don't want to have to go and stoke them. Go visit your neighbor next door and get a piece of charcoal or something. Don't go and collect sticks and start this process. Just an option, just throwing that out there. But yeah, sorry. Jan.
Well, I'm thinking that this may not be easy for everyone. I know it's not easy for me, but I'm hoping that like when you want to make a behavioral change and you snap that rubber band on your head, or you want to go
Sure.
in the right direction, maybe the best direction would be to stop yourself and just go relational.
Yeah.
Because I believe Sabbath is about
Relation.
being relational.
Sure.
And so I think that at any time to observe Sabbath.
Mm.
If we want to connect with someone or embrace a relationship with someone or
Sure.
go in the peaceful direction of just glorifying the Lord. And
That sounds like a great insight.
live it,
Yeah.
that is the best way to go.
Sure.
I think any time we're worried about not observing, if we just say, what would be the most relational thing
Yeah.
to do?
That's a good piece of wisdom. Sure.
Their relationships
If it's a relationship that's between you and God or between you and others, that's probably a good way to go. That makes a lot of sense.
Of course, in a positive way, not a critical way.
Yeah, absolutely.
No criticism involved. I have to say that.
Absolutely. Carla.
Weird question. Did they stone that guy on the Sabbath?
Okay, smarty pants. No, I don't know. That's a great question. They probably held the trial over until Sunday. Angela.
I know we are way off track.
We are way off track, but what a great time we're having. It's all good. You're going to put my cart back on the track? Thank you. Oh, you're just stopping the... Oh, okay. Well, I thought you were going to take us further off the track. That's all good. No, thank you so much. That was a great conversation. It's always awesome to just relate with others about the Sabbath day and what does that mean and how are we doing it. It's great to touch base in that regard. So, the yoke of the Torah. What does this mean? What is the Torah? How do we do that? So, we've already briefly reviewed those two issues. Must the Gentiles convert to Judaism in order to be saved? No, absolutely not. What immediate behavior changes are necessary? That's a key consideration, which we discussed briefly last week, but let's discuss that a little bit further, okay? The council and its ruling. Now, I want to just bring out to you just a couple of historical tidbits regarding the council. It's probably a council of 12 members based upon the 12 disciples, not saying that the council is made up of the 12 disciples. It certainly could have been, but it's likely that there was a council of 12. That's just speculation on the part of a lot of scholars. Likely working just like the Sanhedrin, the Messianic community has its own council, and it is undoubtedly ruled by majority vote. This is the way it is done in the commandments of God, which I will discuss with you in just a moment. We'll take a little bit deeper look at that. Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, is the council president, and his opinion likely carries a lot of weight. As the brother of the Messiah who grew up with him and listened to his teachings. The Testament does tell us that his brothers weren't even believing in him, at least until sometime later. But the ruling council has these following instructions for the Gentiles, that they should abstain from, and I have translated these literally from the Greek. Your Torah, your text may say something slightly different. So when you see my list here, this is exactly what is translated from the Greek. Ceremonial pollution of idols. Okay? Notice what is not mentioned there that might be in your text. Food. There is nothing mentioned, there's no Greek word in there that has anything to do with food. It says the ceremonial pollution of idols. Food is implied. Food is commonly understood, but I just want to bring to your attention that if you look in your apostles' polyglot or something, you'll see that there's no specific mention of food in that first instruction there. Number 2 is sexual immorality. Number 3, what is strangled, and that is literally a Greek word meaning to choke. And then blood. Note again, there is no reference to food or eating blood. Okay? It just says blood. Now, it is linked by a Greek word back to strangled, and food is connected to strangled. So, at the very most, and this is commonly understood amongst most Christian scholars, going back to the church fathers, is that we have 3 instructions here regarding food and one regarding sexual immorality. Does that strike you as odd?
Well, he's talking to Greeks, right?
Absolutely.
He's talking to the Greek culture. And what were the Greeks always doing? They were always buying meat from the market.
Sure.
Which is probably all of that meat, or most of that meat, came from a nearby temple.
Probably.
And then if they were going to the temples locally, one of their main forms of connecting with those gods and goddesses was through the temple prostitutes.
Sexualism,
right?
yeah.
So it's probably talking about just an everyday life for a Greek, which was really closely tied to these temple rituals.
Yeah. And what do you note regarding these issues that goes right back to what we have been talking about since Acts chapter 10, where the people said to Peter after he went and visited Cornelius, "You went to the home of a Gentile and ate with them." What was their concern? Ritual impurity. Every single one of these things has to do with ritual impurity. Every single one of them. And that's why, and you should, if you want to have a good laugh, go to Bible commentaries and read what the commentators say about this passage. It's striking in its hilarity and its absurdity. They have no idea what to do with this. And it shows, because there's a ton of different ideas. You'll see a lot of the word suppose, and it is supposed, and potentially or probably. They have no idea what to make of this, because I think they're not looking at it from the perspective of first century Jews. They're thinking of it from the perspective of 20th century Christians, or 3rd or 4th or 5th century Christians, and we already discussed that within 100 years this religion had become almost exclusively Gentile, and they weren't even sure if a Jew could become a Christian. And if they can, do they have to convert? This thing flipped on its head completely within less than 100 years. So these are very puzzling things to people unless you just bring it right back to its original context of these Jews being terribly concerned of being ritually defiled by commingling with Gentiles, pagan Gentiles at that. Remember that there was some concern about God-fearers. And those are people who already are worshiping the God of Israel and are being welcomed into the synagogue graciously, but we have some concerns because you're not following all of the rules. If you'll just get circumcised, meaning convert formally to Judaism, then you'll have all of the instructions about what ritual impurity is, and we won't have any problems. But now we're converting pure pagan Gentiles, and we got real concerns about ritual impurity. And each one of these is directly related to that. And I'm going to go through these one by one to talk a little bit about what these things are and what they mean. And potentially the biggest question of all that we need to ask ourselves is, how are we going to know what these things mean? You can see in the couple of verses right after what we just read that they wrote that letter, and according to Luke, we have that letter verbatim. Does he give you detailed instructions about how to interpret these 4 things? No, he does not. Does he assume that they're just going to know this? Why would he assume that?
It's taught weekly in the synagogue.
It's something they're doing.
The Greeks?
These are all, they know what they're talking about.
Okay, so yeah, that's a good point. Yes, that's a good point. So it would be common knowledge among the Gentiles. They know the ceremonial pollution of idols. They know that the Jews find that abhorrent. We'll go through these one at a time and discuss them a little bit. But that's the question that I want you to think about is, where are we going to define these terms? Yeah, you know that the Gentiles will be somewhat familiar with what they're talking about, but where's the standard? While the Gentiles will know what these are referring to, will they necessarily know where the standard is in regards to those issues? And where will they get that information? Right there. And it makes sense. It starts to click. It starts to make some sense now. So let's take a little bit of further look at this. Points to note. Everything is done according to the Torah. If you look in Deuteronomy, and I just encourage you to take a look. I'm not going to do that for you now. I may. Let me check my phone to see what time it is. No, I'm not. Just write that down and take a look at Deuteronomy 17. It says, if any disagreement arises among you, what are they supposed to do? If there is a disagreement among you and you guys have some contentious issue, this is
Find a wise person.
go to the place that the Lord shall choose to place his name there. And the Kohanim, the Levite, the priest, and the judge in that day shall render a decision for you. And you shall abide by the decision that they render. That's exactly what they did. They argued about it amongst themselves in Antioch for a while. They decided we got to go down to Jerusalem and hold ourselves a council. It's exactly what they did. They followed the Torah every step of the way to solve this issue. So that's number one. Everything is done according to the Torah. We've mentioned this before. Did you know, and I know that you may not know this or you may, I'm not sure, how many of you have read through the book of Leviticus? That's a tough read. That's a tough read. Did you know that in Hebrew school for Jewish children, that is the very first book they read? Now you might find that a little odd. I certainly did. I thought, man, that's an odd place to start. But you know what's the key of the book of Leviticus? Ritual impurity. And right in the middle of the book of Leviticus, all of these things come right from the middle of the book of Leviticus, chapter 17 through 19. These are things that Hebrew children are instructed in when they start school at the age of 3 or 4. Angela?
This is kind of like when our children, some of the first things we teach them are, don't put that in your mouth.
Yes. That's the first thing we have to teach them, yes. Yes.
Things to
Keep yourself healthy. Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right, Jimmy. It is in a spiritual sense, and yet it makes so much sense that one of the first instructions we have to give our children is don't put that in your mouth. Don't touch that. Don't put your finger in your nose. Don't eat your boogers. This is the kind of thing that we have to teach children. And it just makes sense, doesn't it? And you really need to consider that these Gentiles who are entirely steeped in paganism, that's where they need to start. They are absolutely spiritual children, like Lord of the Flies kind of thing. They're out there just having sex and drinking and partying and sacrificing to idols, and it's a free-for-all. That's the way it is out there. And we need to back them way back and say, don't put that in your mouth. That's where you got to meet them where they're starting from, right? But I think that this is the issue that the Pharisees are bringing to the table here, is they're wanting to jump way ahead. And they're saying, we need to get these guys educated, hard and fast, and now. And Peter is saying, whoa, we need to slow this down. These people know absolutely nothing. Why do you seek to place a yoke on the disciples that is, it's challenging. This is a hard thing. It takes your whole life to learn to walk out the commandments of God. You're not going to slap that on these Gentiles who really need to learn to not put dirt clods in their mouths. That, I think, is potentially what he means when he says, why do you seek to place such a heavy burden on them? Not that the Torah itself is a heavy burden, but that the burden that you're trying to lay everything on them all at once. That's one potential interpretation. The other one is, well, you got a bunch of extra stuff too. So I think you want to consider those things. Derek?
Never.
I will never mind. Angela?
Were you saying back when you were talking about the yoke, that the yoke directs and guides?
Yes.
Right? And so the Torah would be the yoke in this
Yes.
analogy. And
Right.
so the Torah is the light yoke.
Right.
And when you add all that other stuff, that's when the yoke gets heavy because
Right.
it's not just the word of God anymore.
Yeah, and when you put a heavy spirit of condemnation, and when you put a works orientation on it, and you have a very judgmental attitude, and you are holier than thou, and you are demanding that people have a certain standard. Yes, we need to have certain standards, but if you've been walking with the Lord for 30 or 40 years, why would you have the same principle for this person who's 23 years old and has just decided to follow Jesus and they weren't born in a Christian home at all? I'm not saying there's a different standard. I'm saying there's a different path. It's the same path. It's not a different path. It's a different starting point. We're all headed in the same place, but it's a different starting point.
Well, the Lord doesn't expect us to be perfect when we come to Him
No.
right away.
No. And I don't think He ever expects us to be perfect, period. He tells us to be perfect, but I think that's a process, not a goal.
You know everything
Right.
the minute you're saved.
Right,
So you
right.
gotta learn.
And there's a big difference between knowing and doing, too. I know you know that because you guys are all filled with knowledge. But knowledge puffs up. Doesn't always help us to walk. That's the challenge that we're all facing, is knowing a lot of stuff, but not necessarily doing a lot of stuff. Learning to love, to be compassionate with one another, to accept each other where each other is and help each other to move forward, rather than saying, here's where I am, where are you? That's not the right attitude. That's not the right attitude. The right attitude might be, where are you? Regardless of where I am, where are you? Can I help you move forward? Not because I'm better than you, but because I want to see, you know what, I might be more ahead of you, but you can help me move forward. In a way that you're not challenged and I am. There's so many different ways that we're challenged. So, the heart of the Torah, taught to Hebrew children. That's what we're dealing with here, right there in the middle of the book of Leviticus. Now, question. The ceremonial pollution of idols. Does this have to do with food? Well, what is sacrifice to an idol? Food, certainly. But if you read some of these commentaries and some of the ancient documents from those days, you'll see that anything can be sacrificed to an idol. A family pet, gifts of all different kinds, money, tokens, all kinds of different things are sacrificed. Family pets are sacrificed to idols, not just food. So this is talking about ceremonial pollution of idols. It's talking about all kinds of idolatry. And how do we square this with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8:4, where he says, you might have it in your conscience that there is no God in this world aside from the one God, but if you eat meat sacrificed to idols, you might contaminate your brother, offend your brother. Is Paul then reneging on this commandment to stay away from the ceremonial pollution of idols? And maybe you're not quite familiar with that passage, but I would encourage you to look into that, because that's a potentially challenging issue, because Paul seems to be saying, look guys, I know and you know that there's no such thing as other gods in this world. There's only one God. And it's okay to eat food sacrificed to idols because we know that idols are not real. If he's saying that, then he's directly contradicting what James did here at the ruling council. And I would just encourage you to spend a little time in 1 Corinthians and look at some different ideas, because I'm pretty confident through my own studies this last couple of weeks, that's not what he's talking about there. That's not the instructions that we're taking from that. Ideas? Comments?
Well, I had heard that at one point that was referring to the people of that time that were, the Gentiles, if you will, that they used to think in their day-to-day stuff that if they ate that kind of food, which was
Sacrifice to an idol.
That it meant they would take on the nature of the idol. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good insight. That's a good insight. And I would say this, and I'm gonna give you an opportunity, Nathan. I would say this: take what Paul says to the Corinthians in both of his letters with this pinch of salt. The Corinthians were whacked out. This is a letter to a group of people that's doing all kinds of stuff wrong. They are terribly confused. And you might need to just remember that when you're reading these letters to the Corinthians, because they're all messed up. And he's giving them all kinds of corrections for bad behavior. And sometimes he's being a little tongue-in-cheek. And he's correcting them without being a little too harsh. So reread that passage and determine for yourself, and let me know, because I'm going to bring that back to your attention. This ceremonial pollution of idols, and then Paul giving this instruction in 1 Corinthians, this gives the commentators fits. They don't know what to do with this. hold on, Jimmy. I apologize. Nathan?
I'll just throw one more verse into this mix. In
Please.
Revelation 2, the words to Pergamum.
Yep.
It says, I have against thee a few things that thou hast there, that hold the teachings of Balaam, who did teach Balak to cast a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat idol sacrifices, and to commit whoredom.
Yep.
So it's repeated in Revelation, and these are the red letters.
Yep.
Revelation are the red letters where it's repeated.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to eat food sacrificed to idols, and in this it does talk about eating.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
just another verse.
No, that's a good insight. Very good insight. Jimmy?
Yeah, the biggest party you could throw would be to have a bull sacrificed over you and have the blood splash all over
Oh, sure.
you and your friends, and then have a fling.
This is something you've done before, Jimmy?
No,
I'm kidding.
it's not on my bucket.
I apologize, Jimmy. I'm messing with you.
That was rough.
No, but you're absolutely right, and that's good wisdom there. And I would say that the 1 Corinthians, you need to take it in those two pieces of information. But I want to bring one thing to your attention, Angela, before I come right back to you. You're aware, I'm assuming that you were aware, that due to our proclivities to be very friendly towards and open towards the Muslim religion, that many of the things that you buy at the store are stamped halal.
Right.
You know that is meat that has been sacrificed and prayed over by an imam specifically dedicated to a false god called Allah. I would strongly encourage you to stay away from meat sacrificed to idols. Now, what does that mean for you? Do you need to start checking labels? Well, you know what? You might. You might. I know that if you're concerned at all about polluting yourself with food that is, well, let me rephrase that, with things that are not food, then many of you are already doing that. You're looking at your menus and you're looking at your labels and you're saying, is there shellfish and pork in this somewhere? Because oftentimes there is. And that's just something you may need to check out to defend yourself. Angela and then Brianna.
Well, I know that when we talk about food, that sometimes we get narrow focused on what we're eating and putting in our bodies. But when it comes to food, there's also that spiritual side to it. And it kind of goes back to what Darla said, where what you consume, you take on those properties. And so when you consume things sacrificed to it, you might want to extend that beyond just what you're cooking and putting in your mouth.
Right.
Also what you're putting in your eyes and your ears, what you're consuming, just like you consume the Word of God, the bread from heaven, that you may be consuming things that
that's a tremendous bit of wisdom, and I think feeding yourself with the words and imagery of things that you have in this culture around you is terribly critically important. But you also may take that to the level of, what are the doctrines that I bring into myself through different teachings? Maybe I'm listening to some teachers out there that are just not teaching the Word of God. That maybe there's very little of the Word of God, and we're listening to pop culture sermons that are telling us how to feel good about ourselves. Doctrines that are mixed doctrines of men and God. We know that God hates mixing, and if you take a lot of ideas that men have come up with and you mix them with the ideas that God has come up with, you might be getting yourself confused. It's real easy to get confused in that regard. Brianna, did you want to mention something?
I was just wondering what meat you were talking about. I didn't hear you.
Halal. This is meat that is, you know how it's got a big K on it, it says it's kosher.
Or an R.
Yeah, or an R. Well, there's a big H that stands for halal, and this is meat that has been sacrificed to Allah. It's probably big in Minnesota. I don't know. No, I mean, there's a big Muslim population there in Dearborn, Michigan. I apologize. Well, look at everybody's freaking out. Daryl.
You're going to see, you might be shocked as to how many retailers, food retailers, are starting to stock and sell that type of meat. I mean, major retailers.
Well, and they're terrified. You don't offend Muslims. It's totally okay to offend Jews and Christians. You can make comedy shows about that all day long. You do not, however, offend Muslims. And so we are very much placating a la Neville Chamberlain. We're going full on Neville Chamberlain with the Muslims at this point. And so they're making some serious inroads into our culture. And I just want you to be aware of that, to be considerate of that. Michael?
I was just thinking, I've seen that on other packaging, but I've seen it where it has halal and kosher.
Oh, yeah. That's called ecumenicalism.
I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, you wouldn't think
it's
you
possible to
you
eat
wouldn't.
both at the same time.
No,
I think the kosher food is also blessed
Yeah.
to Yahweh, which is not necessarily scriptural, I don't think.
No,
And
not
part of
necessarily.
The kosher process is
Sure.
blessing it. Is
Right.
in similar
Right.
ways that the Muslims do.
Yeah. And I mean, even in these times in first century Judaism that we're reading about, the Gentiles would make fun of these Jews because they would only buy meat from a butcher of their own kind.
The way Jews slaughter, especially a beef, is it takes time. They basically put it into a trance. They move its head around, and
Yeah.
it's
Quite interesting, isn't it?
And they put electrodes on their heads, and they don't even know that they're dying. They really do exsanguinate and just go to sleep.
I have not seen that done myself, but I have spoken with people who have actually been involved in the ritual slaughter of an animal through a kosher butcher and have said it is not at all what you would think it was. And it was quite fascinating and very much... When seeing an animal killed or slaughtered is never a pleasant thing, but this was something new and different for them. I haven't not experienced that myself, neither do I intend to, but I don't want to know where the things come from that I'm eating.
Conversely, you do not want to watch the YouTube for halal kosher, because it's torture.
Yes, I have heard about that.
They basically skin it alive.
Yeah,
It's unbelievable.
Anyway, my advice would be to be circumspect. Watch out regarding that.
We don't know what kind of meat we're buying from the stores. I mean, that's a little bit of a conspiracy, but who's
Sure.
to say that the meat we buy at the stores today is not still sacrificed items?
Sure. Yeah, it's entirely
Even
possible.
without the halal thing.
Yeah, that's possible. Well, you know, it's full of God knows what chemicals and yeah, it's an abomination, undoubtedly. I'm going to pause right there. We have to fellowship together. There's food to be ate, and as far as I know, it's all.
3 more minutes.
What's that? Well, that's okay. By the time I pray and everybody gets up and stretches their legs, the mozzarella sticks will be ready. So next week we'll pick up to finish up the ruling council. No, excuse me, I apologize. The following week. Do remember to spend time with one another. If you have an opportunity to say, hey, we should get together for lunch or something, you should do that. You know, on these third Fridays that we're taking off every month, I do really want to enjoy company with some of you, perhaps. Share each other's company at home by yourselves if you like. But it is a time of rest, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. Let us pray.